I'm Kara O'Donnell, your host for County Board Wrap-Up, where each month we ask the county board members about the key actions the board takes at its monthly meetings and how those actions impact you, your family, and our community. Today, I'm joined by Board Chair Christian Dorsey and Board Member Matt DeFerranti. Christian, Matt, thank you as always for being with us today. Let's dive right in with the residential redevelopment in the Ballston, Virginia Square area, specifically along Washington Boulevard. We've talked about this in the past, but made some headway at this month's meeting.
Sure did. We considered a project right there at the corner of Washington Boulevard and Kirkwood. That's part of, as you alluded to, it's part of a bigger full block study, and we looked at a project that came before us, and it was for some additional density, but it also will result in some additional open space over time as we build out this full block. It's for a total of 225 units, of which really pleased that 16 of them will be affordable, and there's some multifamily affordable units in this project. I think it's a great project, and we had a full discussion. It's also energy efficient at LEED Silver, which is a standard that we use that's so important. And we had some community input with respect to there's a historic Balls Hill burial ground there, and we got some input from our commissions, our Historic Affairs Commission, and we're able to provide a little bit of a process that we'll take to make sure that we address the concerns to keep that space true to its original founding, but also see what we can do to find out who actually are the heirs to that cemetery. So that's a piece of what we did, and I was particularly pleased with that addition to make sure that we're addressing community concerns.
Mm-hmm. What were some of those concerns? Like, what was really the impetus behind this redevelopment project?
Well, I think there's an open space component there's been an interest. If you have gone by that corner, it almost feels like there's a former and a historic insurance agency from the 1950s that's still operating there, and so it really is going to look a lot better. And I think we took a look at both the renderings that we saw and also heard community input. So I think the community was really focused on the cemetery and making sure that in the middle of that block, it's a walkable area where they can find open space, and I think that was a good step.
Just to be clear, this is the area kind of where the Legion is.
That's right.
And a few other buildings similar to it in structure.
So we've talked about this for the last couple of years, and we did a study of that entire comprehensive block, as Matt mentioned, and the Legion project was the first specific project that was approved under this special GLUP study. This is the second one, and now we await the third piece of the puzzle. At some point we expect the YMCA to want to redevelop their property. And instead of looking at all of those individually and trying to deal with them individually, I'm really pleased that we looked at them comprehensively so that we can make sure there was appropriate density, appropriate infrastructure, that we figured out who should be responsible for delivering what level of infrastructure and when, and how we could have open space assets that actually benefit people beyond the development of this block.
Right. And of course, it also includes the affordable housing component, something which is always an issue here in Arlington. What are those components in detail?
Well, there's 16 units, of which 8 will be multifamily, and that's, we have really tried to focus on making sure that in these projects there is a multifamily component. That's where there's a real need. So there's also a cash contribution, which is under our Affordable Housing Investment Fund and under our ordinance. So those two components, I think, are actually going to make for a good affordable housing piece to this project. And that's above and beyond. There's investment that's coming in our water and wastewater system through this. The developers made a contribution there, and also some improvements to the signal right there at Washington and Kirkwood. So affordable housing, I think, is strong on this one, as are the total package of community benefits that are provided through it.
And then in addition to just kind of more modern looking structures as opposed to what's there now, it's a pretty high trafficked area, both vehicular but also pedestrian, bikes, that kind of thing. When this is all said and done, what are the folks who traverse through that area, and some who will be living in that area, what will they experience when it's all done?
So they're going to have wider sidewalks with which to traverse a very high traffic area through all modes. Remember, this is pretty close to two metro stations, in fact, Clarendon and Virginia Square. So we do expect a lot of multimodal connectivity, so we need wide sidewalks to accommodate it. Then you have, as Matt referenced, some improvements to stormwater management, where this site, because of a storm sewer that's running through it, is going to relocate it, but has designed the building in such a way that they're going to deal with stormwater runoff and create some wonderful natural spaces that'll probably attract pollinators and also serve for stormwater management at the same time. So, it is fundamentally delivering some key improvements that even if you are not living in one of those 225 units, as you navigate around that area, we expect that it will be not only more pleasing, but also safer.
Good. Okay. Well, speaking of multimodal transportation, another topic that came up was, of course, the scooter and e-bicycles demo project.
Yes.
And we decided to expand that pilot program as it is. Why was that?
Well, the big reason is we want more data. This demonstration project is all about collecting data so that at the end we can regulate these devices appropriately. And while they prove to be pretty popular thus far, with over 300,000 rides taken in Arlington, we think that there's a huge benefit by having the upcoming summer and fall months, where they're probably going to be most utilized, to really collect some data so that we can have informed regulations. And we have to regulate these by the end of the year. Otherwise, the Commonwealth of Virginia has actually enacted some law this year which would provide for regulations of scooters and electric bikes. But if we don't act by the end of the year, it's the Commonwealth's rules which prevail. So we think it's important to make sure we have as much data as possible so that we take advantage of our window to figure out how these should work in Arlington.
What kind of data are we actually talking about here, in addition to just how many trips are being taken?
Yeah, so we're looking at how far these trips are, which is a key thing to understand what transportation solution they're solving. So, for example, if the trips are a few hundred feet or a quarter mile, well, that seems to be more of a recreational use. But if the trips are a mile or more, maybe it's solving a key issue with connecting people to transit. Also depends on where those trips are going. So can we tell that they're going to homes, or are these replacing bus trips or metro trips? So we want to look at all of those things. And we also definitely want to make sure that the rules and regulations that we have as part of this project are being followed, making sure that responsible parties are riding them. So lots of things that we're looking at.
Yeah, I think it's important just to touch a little bit on what in Richmond the legislature did, and also make it clear that we want to make sure we regulate this properly. So we extended the pilot not so much because we want to get it right and have all the protections that we can, while also recognizing that the way state law is written, this is not something that we can prohibit. And I think most folks would recognize that if it's done safely, this is can be an addition to our multimodal piece. So we're extending the pilot. We're also seeing how we can make sure we can regulate well. And to your point, Christian, we extended the length of the time when we can get input, and we've had a lot of input, but through June 30th, and folks off the county website can, of course, find how they can send us an email and provide their thoughts on this process.
Is there also any kind of regulation being discussed in terms of how many of the scooters? I know what started a lot of the, not controversy, but questions, concerns, is that they just kind of showed up in the county one day. It wasn't a gradual process, or there wasn't kind of a launch or a county-led effort. They just kind of showed up on the sidewalks.
That's right. And until we actually created this demonstration project, Kara, we would have no ability to determine how many of them were in Arlington or how they were used. The law was so silent on this issue as to create basically anarchy. There could have been as many as the companies wanted to allow. So we worked with them to put a box around it, to say, look, we want to study this, we want to do it right, we want you to limit the number that you deploy in Arlington. We opened it up to as many companies as wanted to participate, but none of them were allowed unlimited scooters here. So our demonstration project was to limit something that was limitless. And so we're thankful that we had that cooperation from the companies. But now this is going to lead to what exactly are going to be our regulations, whether they are able to be on sidewalks, at what speed. As Matt said, we can't ban them. Right. That will not be an outcome because the state will not allow it. But if we act by the end of the year, we can create some clear limits.
Anything surprise you so far with the data?
Well, for me, I was surprised. I think we were at 1,500 different entries, different citizen input, different emails that had come through, which is a lot more than we get in a lot of our outreach. And then I think it's more than doubled. And so we've gotten a lot of input. And I think it's fair to say not everyone has been excited. We got some pictures of scooters. I walked by near Teddy Roosevelt Island. There was a scooter that was off the wood path, kind of dangling in the sides. Okay. And there's some concern, but I think that folks want to share with us what's going on. And I also think we should say that each member of the board has really expressed within what we can enforce. And we actually had some discussion of this on Tuesday. We want to enforce and make sure that safety is paramount. And so that's part of what we're doing.
And I got to tell you, that's what surprised me the most. Is not really the data. It's actually the observed experiences of how people are using them. So if I can, Kara, let's do a little public service announcement. If you're under the age of 16, you should not be on a scooter. If you are on a scooter, it's really wise to wear a helmet. The scooters are not really designed for multiple people to be on them at one time, especially if one of them is your infant. So if we could, these are all things that we've seen, observed, and we would just encourage people, as much as we can do a lot to regulate the scooter companies, we also really need for people to exercise good judgment when they use them.
Some common sense and responsible use.
That would be helpful.
That would be good.
That would be helpful.
And I think essential, because the first I've seen, I came upon near Lee Highway an individual who'd fallen off a scooter coming down, and I got there a few minutes afterwards, but there was a nurse already tending to him, and he had a cut on his head. So the safety message and the helmet, if you can, those, and making sure that these are not for children to be using. There's real concern because there are instances where we've seen serious injuries, and so that element of personal responsibility we have to make sure everyone hears.
All right, well, we will stay tuned on that one. And we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to finish our discussion with a look at the board's decision to enable the spread of 5G technology in Arlington. Stay with us. Welcome back to County Board Wrap-Up. I'm your host, Kara O'Donnell, and today we're chatting with County Board Chair Christian Dorsey and Board Member Matt DiFerranti about some of the actions the board took at its June meeting and how those actions are going to impact you and your community. So this has been one that's a little awkward to even talk about, and I'm just going to put that out there. But the board did set a new cap for board members' salaries, and it's generated a lot of interest on both sides of the issue. So we'll just put out of the way right now that it's a little awkward to talk about, but explain the discussion behind that.
You know, so one, it is awkward because, you know, having 5 people have a conversation that ultimately is going to affect what they earn from their job is admittedly awkward, and it's bizarre. Unfortunately, as is the case with many things in the Commonwealth of Virginia, that's the law.
That's how it is.
That's the way it is. We're required as a board to determine our own salary cap. And interestingly enough, we can only do so once every 4 years when our 5-member board has 40% of the seats up for re-election. So that is prescribed by state law. And that's the only way in which board salaries can be adjusted. There can't be a referendum or any other mechanism. The board has to do it and can only do it once every 4 years. It hadn't been done since 2011. And so if we didn't do anything this year, then the next opportunity wouldn't come until 2023. So we did have a lengthy process, none of which was required, but we felt it was important to really talk about what the appropriate board salary should be. And so we did an action which set the cap. We then, based on economic condition and circumstances, will adjust board salaries in subsequent years as we determine the need.
Okay.
And we got a lot of, we got input, I think it was over 220 separate survey responses. We got some, of course, emails on the topic. But I think it's really important to emphasize that this is the cap and not the actual amount that we would in any given year appropriate or for salaries. And so that's a decision that would come later. But the cap piece of it, I really do think it's important for everyone to be able to serve, and we cannot have a county board where you're only able to serve if you are financially well off. That is not going to serve our community best. And from an equity standpoint, that's just critical to making sure that there are young families represented. Certainly, think of a teacher or firefighter. We would want them to be able to serve as well if they chose to in the midst of their career. So I think that cap point, and then the fairness of making sure that as we continue to grow as a county, 235,000 people by compared with when we started and when these caps began, we have a community that is well represented by everyone in that community.
And I think a lot of the questions people have is, on paper, the board is a part-time gig. I know, I've seen you guys around many, many hours that would go beyond what would be considered part-time. How much is really involved in terms of being a board member?
Well, that is one of those mythologies, that it's a part-time gig. That's not what the law requires. It actually, or states, being an elected official has its own responsibilities. Some of them are statutory, things that we absolutely have to do. We can't delegate or walk away from, and those include not only the dozens of decisions that we make on a monthly basis at our board meeting, but it also includes serving on a number of regional authorities. These are not ceremonial positions. These are substantive positions to which we have limited staff support. It's something that we as board members substantively have to engage in. Those include Metro, serving on the Council of Governments, or the Northern Virginia Regional Commission, Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. I'm not giving you the exhaustive list. That's just an illustrative list. Then there are the many advisory groups that we all liaison with that are very much a part of connecting us to our community, which are things that we are not necessarily required to do, but I don't think I would ever want to see Arlington board members not do that. And then I haven't even touched on the engagement with our community and stakeholders. As we develop and grow, become larger, incorporate new lines of business that weren't apparent 20 years ago, there is a need to be accountable in so many different ways. Yeah, this is not a side gig.
Right.
Yeah. And I think the stakes, if you just consider the stakes over the last 12 to 18 months on Metro, it is so critical we're well represented there, and I think it was nearly an existential question that we get dedicated funding for Metro, and that takes persistence and focus on those big issues. This is not about always getting into the weeds, it's about being aware of the stakes in Metro. And if you think about our decision on Amazon, we did over 30, well over 30 community meetings, and I think that's fair that every part of our community wanted to understand that we were driving a smart bargain. And to do that well, that is some outreach that's critical. And then a third thing in the last 7 months, 6 months, just as I've served on the board, is our budget, getting those decisions right so that we get the resources for schools, but also are good fiscal stewards. Those are three big issues, and I think it's effectively a full-time job to do those big things well.
Okay, and so how does this then roll out? Your action this week set the cap.
It's at the cap.
But how does this then roll out?
So that cap will be effective January 1st, 2020. So that will be the maximum that board salaries can be. And just to get into the weeds a little bit, the cap was set at a level that matches the current individual area median income figure. So that's the point at which half of the metro area's region is earning less and half is earning more for an individual. So it's very much ensuring that we're not creating a cap that privileges the county board position from an income level, nor at the same time are we creating such a burden that we limit the pool of people who can serve. Future decisions about what the salary actually is will have to be made within the context of understanding what our fiscal position is, at least from my perspective. I'm not going to prioritize giving myself a dime more if it means that our community has to go without or has to sacrifice at a greater level. But to the extent that fiscal circumstances do allow it, this would be, to me, an appropriate step and would have an overall net fiscal impact on the county of around $200,000 annually if we went to the maximum of the cap.
And that's on a 1.4 or about 1.4, $1.5 billion budget. And so I think it's important to have that context. And if you're, no matter where your perspective is, if you have a perspective that has been a little more leaning towards the private sector, you want leaders who are going to be the best and brightest. And whether that's those of us who serve on the board now, you want, or whoever it is, think about what you really want. You want that talent, that extraordinary focus on doing the public's business well. If your perspective is a little more public sector, as with all the federal employees, there are issues at stake, and just I named some, but next is climate change and the community energy plan, which will be coming up, and we need to make sure that we do that right. And part of doing that right is having leaders who are representative and who are the best to serve.
Okay, well, let's wrap things up with a little bit of tech news. The board voted to authorize some hearings dealing with 5G technology. Fun stuff. Does Arlington lack in its 5G, or why was this kind of thing needed?
Yeah.
Well, this is a next step so that we can. 5G is a technology that's going to require a lot more smaller wireless antenna, essentially, and so these are about the size of a backpack, but they'll need to be a lot more than the items that you see on the top of buildings now. And this is going to transform the future, really. You're going to have integrated Wi-Fi as you move through Arlington. And this is a request to advertise. We'll be discussing it more next month and finalizing the choices. But essentially it allows Arlington to create a regulatory framework that's fair so that the private sector can start to move forward with this technology that many people think is fairly critical to economic development over the coming years.
What would this mean for Arlington residents, businesses, what have you, in terms of their technological ability?
So, 5G itself is considered by most tech experts, because it's going to deliver connectivity and speeds 100 times greater than current technology. This is really the key way that you get to the Internet of Things and smart cities concepts like autonomous vehicles and the ability to really have true telehealth, where a doctor does not need to have a patient connect in a room to be able to not only get a look at that patient and have a conversation, but to do advanced diagnostics to really reduce the barriers to quality, equitable health care. Anything that has been discussed from a wave of the technology future, 5G is the technological underpinning of it. And in order to make that happen, you have to be able to deploy these small cell wireless facilities. The great news is that technology and aesthetic design has integrated these into things that we already have in our community, like light poles. And so the concept that we are looking at is how to actually have the private sector pay for this technology to go on public infrastructure like street lights. We set the design standards. They go ahead and contribute to the infrastructure, and you'd be hard pressed at a distance to really tell the difference between a current light pole and what is envisioned for these new small cell facilities. So the future is at hand.
Okay. Well, on that note, we'll make that the end of this month's County Board Wrap-Up. Christian, Matt, thank you both very much for joining us to discuss some of the key decisions the board took at its June meeting. And thank you for watching, and we'll be back next month. But remember, all county board meetings are open to the public and live streamed and archived on our website. That's arlingtonva.us. Just search County Board. And of course, if you want to tell us what you think about these issues and others, just write to us at arlingtonva.us/engage. We'll see you next month.